Starting at the beginning of the official history of the African slaves in America, the United States began transfers in the early 17th century. The largest plantations of tobacco and rice in the South were constantly demanding labor. Since there were few white settlers, slaves were brought from Africa to fill the workforce. Black slaves made up the majority of the residents of the African West Coast. The slave trade became more widespread after 1713, thanks to the Treaty of Utrecht, in which England was granted the exclusive right to import slaves from Africa to the Americas. When British ships arrived at an African port to purchase living commodities, the local mediators began negotiating with the ship's captain for each slave individually, inspecting them to ensure they didn't suffer from illness or injury. Each black male cost 100 gallons of rum, which surprisingly could work out to be as little as $30 in today's money. Then, the slaves were transferred to the ship, where they were divided into 3 groups of men, women, and children. They were all loaded into different compartments on a 120-ton ship, usually carrying around 600 slaves, with a manned crew of about 40 to 50. These ships were built specially to transport mass amounts of caged humans. On average, it took 3 to 4 months for the boats to reach their destination. All this time, the slaves were in appalling conditions. Now, let's do some maths. We have this ship that's meant for transporting humans en masse. The vessel has a displacement of 120 tons, with around 600 slaves on board. According to official norms, a person needs more than 2 liters of water per day. The voyage takes about 100 days. Let's reduce the individual's consumption by 1 liter of water per day. It's uncertain how long a person could hypothetically survive by consuming just 1 liter, as it depends on numerous other environmental factors. So, 600 people will consume 600 liters a day for 100 days, requiring 60,000 liters of water. That's without considering the ship's crew, nor the fact that both the crew and the slaves must be fed something. This also seems like a large volume. In current times, on average, people consume between 1.4 and 2.2 kilograms of food per day. So let's suppose that each of the 600 slaves on this ship consumed 1 kilogram of some form of food or provisions each day. That would mean we have a 120-ton ship carrying 60,000 liters of water and 60 tons of food. Well, maybe they replenish their stocks in the numerous ports en route. However, that would be a problem, as there are no ports en route, with their journey taking them across the open ocean of the Atlantic. The ship of Christopher Columbus had a displacement of 200 tons. Its length was 25 meters. How could you place 600 slaves, an entire 40 to 50 man crew, 60 tons of food, and another 60,000 liters of water on such a small ship? Not to mention the means to prepare and preserve those provisions, to prevent the food from rotting and the water from going stale. It's also good to remember the aim was to sell these slaves for profit, and therefore starving or dehydrating your product for 3 months would drastically reduce their value on the market. Upon their arrival in America, slaves were first fed, treated, and then sold. The price of slaves changed over time. For example, in 1795, the price was $300, and by 1849, it rose to $900. On the eve of the Civil War in 1861, the price reached $2,000 per slave. Historians wrote that a single slave in 1795 cost $300. Here, a cow in the year 1800 costs a mere $10. In 1825, an acre of land in South Carolina cost $2, and the cow cost $12. Let's go further. In 1850, a bottle of port wine cost only 11 cents, a piano cost $195, and a brand new house in Brooklyn, New York cost $2,500. Everything seems to be fine with these prices. The house cost only $2,500. Here, historians wrote that a slave of this period costs $900. So, for the price of a slave, you could purchase a large herd of cows. Back to the official history, which stated that southern planters were buying these rather expensive slaves. Historians also wrote that they began to be ridiculed and forced to work 19 hours a day. They were beaten and mutilated because of bad work, sometimes even having their arms and legs cut off. It was a very tragic experience for those involved. But again, we see some inconsistencies. Suppose a man bought an expensive slave for $300 at the prices of 1802, and instead of creating normal working conditions, began to cripple his expensive commodity. Let me remind you that instead of one slave at the price of 1800, you could buy 30 cows. Commonly, as historians have written, slaves were treated very poorly. Now, let's look at the photos of the 19th century. We can see hapless slaves. Most of these images that researchers came across show the ordinary life of villagers in the 19th century. They struggled to find any photos showing the atrocities of slavery. All the horrific stories about slaves were found only in hand-drawn images of this type, although that is not to say they don't exist. Certainly it appears that multiple cases of slavery have been proven. But if you look at the source, it is inferred that this photo is from the second half of the 20th century and was taken in Libya. Here are photos of the late 19th century depicting the life of slavery. It is not unlike the mid-20th century photographs of poor black districts. Here is a signed photograph of a slave auction held in Maryland, 1850. If it wasn't signed, the details would have commonly become unclear about the recorded event within it. Researchers have implored anybody who can provide more photographs from these times to do so. All of us have been taught from childhood about the lives of slaves in the United States, but when you start looking for confirmation of this, you find only photographs from comic books and ridiculous stories. Needless to say that one slave equaled the cost of a herd of cows and 3 slaves that of a new home in New York.